Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to today's episode to the EU Spectator. In this discussion, we'll dive into a fascinating yet troubling paradox of Messianism in Romanian's presidential elections. Why do voters place their hopes in savior-like figures only to see these promises unrevealed? We'll also explore the rise of ultranationalist populism in parliamentary campaigns, examining how these forces shape political discourses and voter behavior in a rapidly changing European landscape. Joining me today, it's my friend and co-host Nils Zalewski, and together we'll unpick the dynamic behind Romania's political stage. Welcome back, Nick.
Thanks for having me. And luckily, we're back at this. Hopefully, the next episode won't take another month. Everyone, make sure to subscribe, comment, and comment on the video with whatever emoji you're feeling Romanian flag, German flag, US flag, whatever you want.
Right. Nick, we have three questions for this discussion. Why are voters drawn to the allure of charismatic yet often dubious political actors? What fuels the electorate's trust in grandiose promises, and how those this impact democracy in the long run? So I invite our friends to stay with us, and we'll try to explain what is happening in Romanian politics. But because I'm directly involved in the Romanian elections, because I'm Romanian, I will ask you to allow me to have a very brief presentation about the situation, the political situation in Romania, because Călin Georgescu's brief yet impact filtration with Romania's presidential candidacy was emblematic of the tensions between populist rhetoric and the electorate search for a political savior. A figure known for his environmental advocacy and involvement with some international organizations, Georgescu initially presented himself as a reformist outsider, but his campaign rhetoric promised a national awakening, targeting systemic corruption, foreign dependency, and what he framed as the heroism of Romanian identity. These messages resonated strongly with segments of the electorate disillusioned by the political establishment, particularly those inclined towards ultranationalist and anti-globalist narratives. But however, we should point out that Georgescu's campaign quickly covered controversy. His alignment with our party, with the Alliance for the Union of Romanians, a party known for its populist and nationalist stance, drew both support and criticism. On one hand, it consolidates his image as a defender of traditional Romanian values, appealing to voters wary of mainstream parties. But on the other hand, it raises concerns about his association with extremist rhetoric and questionable political allies. Georgescu's candidacy became a lighting rod for debates on the fine line between patriotism and xenophobia, with some critics accusing him of with exploiting nationalist sentiment to further his ambition. But Georgescu's messaging was further undermined by his lack of concrete policy proposal and his previous and his opportunism. While he skillfully tapped into popular discontent, actually, he struggled to present a quasi vision beyond broad appeals to sovereignty and national and Romanian national tradition. This left many wondering whether his campaign was a genuine for reform or a calculated attempt to capitalize on the nationalist wave. His inability to distance himself from Ours party, more controversial position, combined with a lack of a political experience, ultimately hindered his credibility among undecided and moderate voters. But in the end, I should say that Georgescu's candidacy highlighted both the allure and the pitfalls of messianic politics in Romania. While he captured the frustration of the frustration of our electorate, his campaign relies on polarizing themselves, and its failure to deliver substantive solutions limited his impact. Georgescu's rise and fall serve as a case study in how charisma and populism can only take a candidate so far without, I don't know, without a solid foundation of trust and practical governance. But starting with this, I really want to hear your opinion about Georgescu's campaign and his success in these presidential elections.
Well, to be brutally honest, I think we could thank the European Union for this because the European Union has spent far too long pointing out that, oh, well, these Eastern EU member states haven't achieved economic convergence yet. Well, okay, Romania and Bulgaria only joined the EU in 2007. But for me, it's very harmful rhetoric from the EU when they're supposed to be celebrating each member state and they put the most bizarre statistics in those infographics from Eurostat. Oh, well, here's the median EU GDP per capita, and here's that of Romania and Bulgaria. Wow, look how low it is. Why are you putting it like that instead of, wow, look at that. Romania's GDP per capita has grown 300 to 400% since 2007. I mean, that would be more realistic in showing that, hey, Romania's been growing really well economically, rather than, oh wow, look at how much lower it's from the median, instead of also looking at, yeah, but look at how much it's progressed in less than 20 years. But when the EU and the Brussels bureaucrats keep on feeding into this, oh well, it's not these member states haven't yet reached the median, they haven't reached the median. Well, what do you expect then when people are saying, well, screw the EU, let's go try to work with Russia because we're not equal to the other EU member states. And the EU does kind of put it in a harmful way of, oh, well, almost making it seem like Eastern EU member states aren't as great of member states as those in the West, especially like Germany, because, but which is sad because right now, with the economic slowdown in France and Germany, you would think that no member states are doing well. Okay, what about Italy? You barely hear, also, even with Italy, with record-breaking low unemployment, 5.8%. Italy had, even in 2007, unemployment was 7 point something percent. So this is historically low unemployment for Italy, historically high employment rate of 62.5%, which is almost, by the way, on par with the employment rate of the US. And you barely hear about that because everyone's so focused on Germany and France. Okay, screw France and Germany. There's 25 other member states. I mean, we only focus on those member states, and then people want to be shocked why a candidate who is against the EU, and I think he even mentioned that he would possibly take Romania out of the EU. Oh wow, why did a candidate do so well? Because you make it seem like if you're not France or Germany, you're not a worthwhile member state to have. And then to a lesser extent, Belgium and the Netherlands, which
Actually,
I want to
sorry,
emphasize.
sorry, Nick. Actually, he mentioned that it's a privilege for him and for himself and for his family to be outside the Schengen area. And also, he said that the European Union, it's not the proper organization for Romania.
Well, I
Well,
mean, and to almost also slowly introduce our second topic, which we'll get to after, is
mhm,
because the EU has a lot of issues that it doesn't deal with, like with energy too. I mean, Germany, the EU's darling, has screwed over all these countries because well, we need to stop nuclear power. Oh,
mhm.
congratulations. Are you happy that energy was costing citizens €1 a kilowatt a day or two ago? Because of the huge spike in energy, and all these other nations were struggling because they're like Sweden, because they're forced by EU legislation to send energy to Germany. No, Germany go without energy if they decide to not produce enough. Why should Sweden be forced to give energy to a member state that was irresponsible, pretending that, oh, we're going to save the environment by going off of nuclear energy, which is also a very clean energy source? I mean, but anyway, back with the EU. Well, will the EU learn to stop presenting EU member states in a poor light? Because to me, they do that constantly. With Eastern EU member states like Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, even though they're the economic engines of the EU, where they're rapidly growing, rapidly expanding.
Okay.
You would never know about it because everyone's just so focused on Germany and France and screw the rest. And then people are shocked when, because I know when people are trying to say that with Russian interference, but I think people are overestimating. The voters are upset in Romania about hearing how terrible their country is from the European Union because, well, you're not one of the more established countries. Well, that's what the Soviet Union will do it to you. And to me, it still is very wrong to think that just because the EU criticizes you, somehow you would be better under a pro-Russian president when now Russia has a lower GDP per capita than any member state in the EU. I think it's very bizarre, and rather Romanian politicians should do more to stand up for themselves and show that, hey, the EU also benefits from these Eastern EU member states, quicker growing economies, and that give it a little more time, and that these Eastern EU member states will probably be blowing them out of the water. Because with the fact that bureaucracy is much less heavy in Poland and other Eastern member states than, say, Germany, France, or Italy, where so many things could be a nightmare. And then, you're going to have these member states having to actually reform their systems more to catch up with the East. That'll start blowing them out of the water. But, this is what happens. This is what happens when the EU doesn't celebrate the achievements and instead, for some bizarre reason, oh, here's an infographic to celebrate Romania's National Day. Oh, look, the GDP per capita is lower than the media. If you want to present that, it should have been an asterisk or something, and right next to it, oh, but GDP per capita has grown by, has tripled since it joined the EU. Why wasn't that included as vital information, which is true? People forget about how quickly things have grown. And, this is similar to Poland because, for example, there's some Polish people getting upset about the cost of housing increasing, and they're trying to solely blame Ukrainian refugees. When
Yeah.
partially, yes, when you have over 1 million Ukrainian refugees moving, that increases the cost of housing. But the cost of housing is also increasing because Polish wages are increasing at a staggering rate. And people don't necessarily realize that because there's never the focus on the economic accomplishments of these member states. For example, Poland's minimum wage is now provides you a better quality of life than the US federal minimum wage.
Okay.
And yet there's little recognition to these economic accomplishments. And we're even getting to the point that while, as you know, Italy has the highest number of Romanians outside Romania within the EU.
Hmm.
However, immigration has rapidly slowed because, sure, wages are so lower in Romania, but even when you also look at other member states like Germany, when you start factoring in the cost of living, the cost of rent, the cost of everything else, there's a significantly less economic benefit because, for example, when Romanians were first immigrating to Italy, the Italian wages were 9 times higher. Now they're not even 3 times as high.
Yeah,
And
but
then that's even
what?
before factoring in the cost of living.
Yeah, but just I just want to understand also me, and I hope that our watchers and our friends wants to understand too. Why the Romanian because you mentioned the diaspora and the Romanian and Polish immigrants. Why the diaspora uh, are supporting the Romanian diaspora are supporting Georgescu's campaign and Georgescu's candidacy to the presidency, and why they are trying to explain to the Romanians in the country and also to the European authorities that um, we are here in Romania. We are we are the slaves of the EU and NATO, but and at the same time they are working in the EU countries, and they feel the privilege to be the EU to be a EU citizen. Why are
Because they don't necessarily feel the privileges just because of how heavy the bureaucracy. I mean, even here, where I'm almost having to consider
okay?
that, where yes, it's a little different for me because I'm not an EU citizen, but still, because I'm a US citizen, that's significantly different than if I was a citizen, for example, from Pakistan, where there's a lot less trust in the government and there's a lot more forgeries with documents, or for example, with Bangladesh, how now Italy it has suspended giving work permits because of how often the documents are faked. And yet, if you're not Italian, and this isn't even just true for Italy, it's in a lot of Western EU member states, you're kind of treated like a second class person, where you're looked down on. And is especially true for Romanians, where they might have had a specific degree, and yet they're working in a job that doesn't pay nearly as much as they could make because, oh, well, you're not Italian, so we won't hire you for this role. And that's sadly true in Germany, Ireland, all these countries. You know, and this gets to the topic of European Union citizens are incredibly racist. It's so bizarre to me when people try to tell me, oh, we don't have the issue of racism like you do in the US. It's like, what are you talking about? In Europe, there's the issue of you're not the right type of European. Where if you're German, the French hate you. If you're French, the Germans hate you.
Hmm.
You know, if you're Romanian and Polish, people in Western Europe look down on you, even though their economic growth is in part because of labor from Eastern Europe supporting their economies. I mean, what are these nations in Western Europe going to do when people start moving back to Poland and Romania when there's no longer a benefit of living there and life is so intolerable because of how unfriendly they are? I mean, you run into situations where they could just be very hostile. And then just the fatigue of the bureaucracy where it's like, oh, why put up with this instead of just moving back to your member state, especially when the economy is growing as well as it is. And as people are mentioning, that especially if you could find a job in Bucharest, Bucharest is one of the better performing economic regions of the EU right now, where it's like, why would you move to another place in the EU if you could just go look for a job in Bucharest instead? And when Romanians are treated so poorly outside Romania, I do understand them saying, F the EU. Why remain part of the EU if this is how EU citizens treat us, where they treat us as if we're lesser than them because they're from Western Europe. And well, this is a person with a Romania passport, where it doesn't matter how long they live in Western Europe, they will never be considered uh one of them because, oh, well, you're from Romania. You might have a bit of an accent, so you'll never be a German or a French or an Italian.
Okay, so in your opinion, this is a cause of this high level of nationalism and high level of Euroscepticism. Uh,
Well, that and the fact that well, that and with the criticism, because I think Romanians might partially be watching what's happened to Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Spain,
Hmm.
with the pigs countries, where when they were suffering, what was the response from the EU and the European Central Bank? Well, we're not changing rates to help you.
Okay.
We're not going to help you economically. And now, when it comes to Germany struggling, oh, we might have to change rates. We have to do something as a policy in order to help the German economy. Excuse me? Sure, Germany's the largest economy, but it doesn't even make up half of the EU economy, much less than half, much less than half of the Eurozone. Why are you going to now change rates in favor of the German economy when there's other economies? Why doesn't the EU and the European Central Bank have the same attitude towards Germany and saying, get your shit together, reform as a nation in order to be better economically, instead of, well, let's try to manipulate rates in order to try to help Germany when other member states have made strides to do better. I mean, with the fact with Italy, how Italy now has a lower unemployment rate nationally than 10 other member states. And yet the EU doesn't highlight that, doesn't applaud it. And that's definitely why I feel Euroscepticism across the EU is just increasing as a whole because people are really realizing, unless you're Germany, unless you're and then to a in France,
Hmm.
lower extent Netherlands, Belgium. If you're not, or Sweden, if you're not one of the chosen countries, almost, well, then you're treated poorly. You're treated as you're not as important, and people are just sick of that. And there's because we've also seen that with the war in Ukraine, for example. It's countries like Poland and Lithuania, in particular, that basically have to drag Germany screaming and kicking. Enough is enough. You have to give weapons. You have to help Ukraine. And there's Germany showing how it's no longer the leader of the EU. It's being led by these smaller countries. Even though Lithuania and Poland aren't as developed economically, they're showing that they're smarter and more intelligent than Germany right now, with the fact that you have to make a decision now regarding the war. You can't be like Chancellor Scholz, who is so useless. And thank God Germany should hopefully be having new elections because he was so famous for every time of, well, I have to take 3 months to decide if we'll send these missiles to Ukraine. I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? It's a war. You can't take 3 months to decide. You have to decide instantly.
Hmm.
And that's just, and I feel that's a problem that Romanians are realizing that, well, yes, let's not get it wrong. Romania is benefiting economically as a member state in
Totally
order to
agree.
develop its economy. But
Yeah.
when nobody acknowledges this progress in the EU, it harms all the growth that's been happening because of how they're framing it. Where, because for example, the racist rhetoric from Germany, when Poland's national government was happy with the economic progress and saying, hey, if things keep up, Poland could pass up Germany's economy. Oh, well, what are you saying? That's not going to happen for many years. It just came off as so racist and so arrogant and such a superior complex on the part of Germany. It's like, no, these other member states have to reform if they want to remain competitive. And I got to be brutally honest. Luckily, the US did elect Trump because the EU will have to get off its rear end and actually help these member states become more economically competitive. Because as people have showed, the EU was almost neck and neck with the United States economy before, and now it's significantly smaller.
Yeah, but I can understand where are all those people, all those Romanians, which are acting against the European values, against the European Union as per se, because during the presidential campaign in Romania, there were, mm, you know, they were acting only on the TikTok, Facebook groups, X, and etc. But my question for you is, it's enough to have a voice only on social media, or we should be involved also in the social life? Because if you will stay only on the social media, uh, we can become a vulnerability for the state. So it's enough to just to scroll some messages or images on the social media, or if you want to change something, we should be very actively in terms of social life.
No, it should be both. It should be, yes, while getting your message out on social media, also in the social life, which right now, the Romanian government and other member states need to definitely do more, and they need to put Eurocrats in their place by showing how well their economies have developed. And
Okay.
unfortunately, with the current Romanian government, they're not doing that. They just kind of let the EU be racist toward them and post out these bizarre stats. I mean, I gotta admit, why are these national politicians not calling out the Eurostat and saying, "Hey, why are you publishing statistics in this manner to celebrate national days?" I mean, they can't put out other statistics like for example, with Romania being the first country with the electric street lights. You can't put something positive about the country rather than and showing how much they're growing economically rather than, oh, but they're below the EU average. It's like, well, okay, but that's also in nominal terms too. What about when we talk about purchasing power parity and how quickly it's improving? And, and unfortunately, we're for Romania's current government, when they just kind of sit there and take it, I think
Mhm.
people are just kind of getting sick of it because I still see a lot of criticism about Eastern EU nations where people just know very little about them. And I see that even within uh, the EU itself, you know, not trying to talk poorly about my colleagues in the PhD program, but so many of them just don't understand why I'm interested in also studying about these other member states
Okay.
in the east of the EU. It's like, well, what do you mean? This is where a lot of the opportunities are going to uh, be created. The fact that these economies are expanding much quicker than Western Europe, and the fact that wages are uh, moving on, catching up much quicker, and where with us being younger researchers, in reality, where could more opportunities be created for us in these Eastern EU member states rather than these more established countries, which are seeing chronically slow economic growth? And, hopefully the candidates, yeah, once this election eventually takes place again in Romania, hopefully candidates like Lasconi put
Yeah.
on display about how well Romania has done in the EU, how it is positive, and how to address some of the criticism from other EU member states, some of the racism, simply doing PR campaigns. Because I got to admit, while some member states are slowly doing that,
Yeah,
uh,
but the
they
problem.
need to be doing more with these tourist campaigns too, and getting people to come and see the economic growth for themselves, which isn't necessarily the case. I mean, not just with Americans, but as people joke in general, when people talk about going on vacation within Europe, they usually go to, Italy, France, Germany, and that. You got to get people to Romania, Poland, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, all these countries to see how what enormous developments have occurred since these member states have joined in 2004, 2007. And I feel that unfortunately these politicians are sometimes falling flat, and hopefully they really push this and say, hey, look at how Russia's economic growth and how it's stalling and how it could rapidly go down with the fact that the value of the ruble is dropping, how Russia was stopping the exchange of the currency in order to try to manipulate the value. So push is say like, hey, there's problems in the EU, but we could still reform that rather than trying to put ourselves back into the dark ages of being part of the Soviet Union that did not benefit Romania.
Right, but it's ridiculous. You know why? Because during the presidential campaign, Georgescu and the other Lasconi, Marcel Ciolacu, Nicolae Chukub, all competitors in in these elections, talked only about the LGBT danger and LGBT propaganda, anti-LGBT propaganda, if we should accept the civil partnership for the LGBT community or not, if you should recognize the LGBT community or not. But at the end, um, there were no debate about the projects that can restore our powerful into the European Union. Were no debate about a country project about how we can achieve the benefits to be part of the EU and
Which is
NATO.
on them, though.
Everything,
I mean, these candidates
everything.
should have reshifted the conversation to that and talk about and not focus on that. Where they
Yeah, but
and
it's strange that we are, you know, in a country that it's recognized for its pluralist society. It's very strange that during electorate campaign we are talking only about the LGBT community. It's it's unbelievable for me in 2024 to discuss only about the LGBT, not about, I don't know, the economic problems, the how can we reduce the economic and social gap between the territory in Romania
well,
and
and that's the
so on.
fault of Lasconi and other candidates. Why were they allowing so much of it to be focused on that? Rather, they should have been taking charge of the debate and trying to redirect it and sure, maybe give their position on that, but also redirect it. But to be fair, I think we're also seeing a lot of debate about that because we're seeing the negative repercussions, especially with some of the trans legislations in
Mhm.
countries. The fact
Yeah.
that we allowed children to mutilate themselves before they were even an adult. The fact that there's so many lies about some of the healthcare
Mhm.
with trans individuals, especially as children, that they should not be allowed to make when they're children and aren't yet entirely sure because whether people want to accept it or not. With the issue of gender dysphoria, a lot of times it does resolve it on its own. For example, the famously cited study that shows about 80% of the time it resolves on its own without having to actually transition yourself to the opposite gender. That in reality, it's unfortunately for individuals because puberty is an uncomfortable time in our lives.
I
That for
agree
some,
with
they're
you.
uncomfortable with the process, but then it resolves once that ends. For some, no, it doesn't. And for them, they truly do want to transition as adults. However, they're adults and they can make their minds up. Children don't necessarily know what they want necessarily, as people have pointed out, and we're seeing the harmful effects of people taking puberty blockers, which are not completely reversible. They're making the
Yeah, but I think that for Romania it's a false debate and a false problem because we are still a very conservative society. So I I can understand why we should discuss about the LGBT community because it's not a problem for Romania. And we are not discussing, we're not debating about political and economic problems.
I
But
know, but the problem is sometimes, which I do understand why, even though Romania is a much more conservative nation, things could change in an instant, where all of a sudden, if there was a government
yeah,
where, for some bizarre reason, that they did believe in this and they were going to let these children transition, it could happen relatively shortly within a year or two, where you have all this legislation, and then you have people doing these operations as children, which even though we're seeing in Western Europe, like Sweden, how they're not allowing some of these procedures anymore for children, realizing it's more
Yeah,
harmful than
that's
helpful
that's true.
when they're not 100% certain whether this gender dysphoria is because they're still going through puberty or it's because this is how they truly believe themselves. This is a decision they want to make in an adult. But so, and the fact that it's also kind of the fact that there isn't common EU legislation, Romania could easily all of a sudden change where you have these politicians putting forth this crazy legislation. But again, like I said, just to reiterate, other candidates need to sure they could focus on that, but focus on the other strengths, focus on the strengths of Romania being an EU member state, saying, "Hey, we're not going to talk." If I feel it would have been more beneficial if you have candidates and I keep on saying Lasconi just because she came in second place. If Lasconi was more powerful and saying, hey, we've had all this economic growth as an EU member state, it's beneficial. However, we're not going to tolerate the negative aspects. I'm going to fight as presidents against the racism that we experience as Romanians within the EU. We're not going to tolerate that anymore. I don't think you would have had this the pro-Russian candidate doing as well if you had candidates like that. But because his message came off as more strong, while these others candidates, it's more almost like we're just going to kind of accept the status quo. We're not going to try to work to make Romania as great as it can be. Well, then you have this nutcase who wants to take Romania back to the Soviet Union, doing better because part of the issue too is that I'm sure that if you went on the street and asked a typical Romanian, do you know how much Romania's GDP per capita and GDP have both grown since we have become an EU member state? Most of them will not realize because of the current narrative of, well, Romania isn't as doing as well economically as Germany yet. Okay, and what about the progress that has been made? Because people keep on forgetting that Rome wasn't built in a day. Neither will Romania's economy be built in a day. So let's focus on what it's achieved and focus on getting a president who will do everything they can to keep that economic growth soaring so
Mhm.
it can catch up and possibly bypass Germany economically. But instead, you just have these candidates where it's kind of, oh, we'll just accept the status quo. It is what it is. That's not a popular message with citizens, especially when there's things to tackle. If everything was perfect in Romania, if Romanians weren't facing racism and second class treatment within the EU, sure, then you could have someone saying, hey, let's just continue things as it is. But when things need to change, you need a strong leader.
Right. I totally agree with you. But because we are talking about elections, I really need to know, in your opinion, who proved to be a more effective influencer for Kalin Georgescu and the other competitors and the sovereignists? Was it TikTok or mass media or institutions like the Supreme Council of National Defense? I don't know, the Constitutional Court, the Permanent Electoral Authority, because in the end, who benefits more from these decisions, if not the sovereignists and Georgescu himself, who climb in the polls by portraying themselves as opponents of a corrupt system and corrupt politicians that supposedly ignores the will of the people.
I
Because
think
you mentioned the absolutely unpredictable campaign from Lasconi.
Honestly, I think Georgescu's benefiting the most from everything, especially I think he does benefit the most from the Constitutional Court's decision. I mean, unless they put forth clear steps about how we're going to protect Romania's future presidential election from Russian interference,
Mm.
it makes the system look like sore losers. And that's
Oh
the
yeah.
issue that we're not really necessarily hearing about. Here is exactly how Russian interference played into it. So this is what we're going to do to block it. Because it's a bit bizarre when you look at Moldova's election and the fact that Sandu won, that it's not in the EU, it's not in NATO. Moldova does not have the protections that Romania does, but all of a sudden Romania's election was, and I think the current Romanian government as a whole looks like sore losers when it's trying to place his success solely on Russian interference, Russian interference. That's not entirely true, though. While it may have played a role, I think it's part of the fact that these other politicians are running poor campaigns and they allowed Georgescu to get away with things where, like you're saying, instead of focusing on LGBT issues, they should be focusing on the horrific actions of Russia in the present and past and saying, do you really want to work with Russia, which would be the reality under Georgescu? Do you want to give him do you want to give Putin the opportunity to replicate some of the past tragedies and almost attempted genocides. Like, do we really want to give Russia the opportunity to try to replicate the Holodomor in Romania now? That was originally took place in Ukraine. Do you want him to try to possibly starve Romanians because, oh, well, I need the food for my troops to fight the war in Ukraine. So, sorry, Romania, we just got to take your food from you. I hope you understand. Which would possibly be the case if Georgescu willingly helps to try to rebuild the Soviet Union. And shame on these campaigns for just kind of sitting there and just trying to say, oh, well, we did badly because of Russian interference, because of TikTok, instead of thinking about what they could do to get around that. Uh, because that's almost what happened in the United States elections, where with Trump, Trump won despite how corrupt mainstream media is, where they really play in favor of Biden and the establishment, where Trump won despite of that. And these Romanian presidential candidates now have to look at, well, how could we win in spite of some of these factors that are playing against us, rather than sitting there and saying, oh, well, it's impossible because of TikTok. Because if we look at the voters who were also primarily voting for Georgescu, wasn't it like 35 to 49-year-olds? That's not the key demographic on TikTok. So it's wrong to try to sit there and say, oh, well, it's only because of TikTok. It's only because of these social media posts. Because when I was reading some of the comments from Romanians on Reddit, they were kind of indicating otherwise. And they were kind of mad with leftists in Romania trying to blame it entirely on social media and saying, no, this is because of a conversation that you just apparently don't want to participate in. And that's where these candidates have to regroup, which now they have time because of the fact that Romania will have another first round of the election again, since the first round of the results were also no longer valid. Regroup on how you're going to fight Georgescu rather than trying to say that, oh, well, it was just because of this Russian interference. And stop focusing on the LGBT issues, where if they want to comment on it quickly, then redirect the conversation. Don't let Georgescu get away with driving these debates to his favor. And unfortunately, it seems like that's what these candidates allowed to happen, and they don't necessarily have a plan on what they're going to do better.
Yeah,
Uh,
but for me, as Romanian and as the social actor in Romania, for me it's very clear that TikTok and Russia played a very important role in these elections. But the problem for me as Romanian citizen, it's that it's the lack of actions of Romania's intelligence service in countering direct intervention by TikTok and Russia during the elections. But despite because despite clear signs of foreign influence and such digital manipulation, these agencies fail to neutralize threats that undermine the democratic process. And you mentioned a Republic of Moldova, and I admire the Secret Service of Moldova because they they act. And a particularly alarming revelation involves Romanian, for me, it involves Romanian mercenaries operating in Africa, who are a part of Călin Georgescu action group. This Shaudley network, it's suspected of organize some actions to destabilize society through social terrorism. But yet today's judicial decision to lift all forms of control over these individuals signals a troubling disagreed for the sovereignty of their actions. And it's very strange because prosecutors and the rule of law were dealt a harsh blow by judge who simply failed to grasp the gravity of the threats posed by these actors. But Romanian media has further exposed connections between these operatives, organized crime networks, and transnational mafia groups, painting a grim picture of the force aligned with Georgescu's radical agenda. And this context, in my opinion, this context underscored the vulnerability of democratic institutions when faced with well-organized and well-founded extremist movements. The judiciary's latency risk emboldening these actors, raising questions about the broader implication for national and regional stability. And in this particular case, do you think that radical political movements of fascist or neo-legionary nature, like those aligned with Georgescu, could find support or indirect encouragement from the Trump administration?
I don't know, just because
I,
I
I,
don't think
I'm
they'll necessarily find support from Trump because he's focusing more on prioritizing the US, not getting ourselves involved in the affairs of other countries. But I think they'll definitely find a lot of support within Romania itself because Romania is not necessarily taking actions, as you were kind of mentioning, about these attempts of influence from the outside that simply canceling the first round of results and just not necessarily saying, and these are all the actions that we're going to take in order to make sure it's a safe and secure election, safe from outside interference.
Mhm.
It just makes them look like sore losers, where these traditional candidates can't win against Georgescu, and it's almost like Romania is overstating these outside threats rather than focusing on how they need to campaign better and focus the conversation about the harsh reality of what it would be like if Romania went back into Russia's room.
Yeah,
And why aren't and some of these candidates, if they can't beat them, join them. They should be getting on TikTok and having their campaigns with short TikToks. And they can't pull up old footage showing the poverty and showing how bad things were during the Soviet Union. I'm sure there's plenty of proof where when you talk, when you have people talking about communism, nobody's more against communism than people who experienced life under the Soviet Union. Where, come on, use this as weapons against Georgescu and saying, are you effing nuts? Do you really you really think things are going to be better if we work with Putin, even though he can't make things better for himself? Come on, these Romanian politicians also have to emphasize the fact
yeah,
that
but
in Russia, 20% of Russians still live without indoor plumbing.
I
Do Romanians want to move to that?
Yeah, I agree with you, but I ask you this because in a very short social media post, um, Donald Trump Jr. framed the decision as the decision to annul the elections as an example of a globalist overreach and an attack on the
Well,
will of the
because part of
people.
the problem is when you look at English articles,
Yeah.
they're not specifically describing the interference. So it does make them look like sore losers when in English it's basically like, oh, but there was some interference. And it's like, okay, but then what are you going to do to combat it rather than simply invalid? Because the problem is when Romania is not saying these are all the steps that, when the Constitutional Court is not saying that these are all the steps that the government has to take in order to secure the election, it makes them look like sore losers where they're simply mad that Georgescu won the first round.
Mm.
And unless you actually put forth all the steps that you need to make in order to have a safe and secure election, it does make Romania look very undemocratic where it's like, what, are you just going to simply have presidential elections until Georgescu loses? And that's the issue. Put forth
Yeah,
all the
but
steps that you're going to take in order to make sure that you're not having Russian interference. Not simply allude to it and then not say that these are going to be the steps taken in order to prevent that in a new round of elections. And that's the problem that Romania needs to focus on how it's going to not allow Russia to interfere. Where right now it just seems like more like these loose accusations rather than describing these are exactly the actions that it took. This is what Romania's intelligence operations are going to do in order to prevent that from happening again, rather than simply saying, well, we're not going to allow the election to take place. And that's that's just unfortunately how it comes off outside of Romania. That the
yeah,
back one.
right. I agree with you, but the problem actually, it's not a problem. The intelligence services have declassified the reports presented to the President Iohannis, and they reveals Russian interference. But Donald Trump Jr.'s message for the Romanian electorate could be read in two ways, and this is why I'm afraid because on one hand, it may energize supporters for Georgescu's and similar figures, reinforcing the perception that external forces are working to undermine Romanian sovereignty and Romanian democracy. And on the other hand, it risks deepening polarization by fueling conspiracy theories and undermining trust in democratic institutions. So Trump Jr.'s intervention raised questions about the broader implication of offering a commentary on national politics, especially when it amplifies the divisive rhetoric in an already volatile political landscape. So, do you, just such international endorsement of nationalist rhetoric help or harm Romanian efforts to maintain a credible democratic process in
Well,
a race
Romania is
with the
harming
US?
itself by also not broadcasting this information in English. Because I got to be brutally honest, when I was reading up on the election in English, reading from pro EU news sources,
Okay.
nobody is describing the specific actions. So when I say this, it does make the Romanian government look like sore losers when they're not also broadcasting the evidence in English.
So
When
the
you just
problem is,
say, "Oh, Russian interference," people are sick and tired of hearing Russian interference without specific descriptions of evidence from the Romanian government of what happened.
so
And
the
the
problem is
problem
the
is
lack.
Reuters and all these news sources are not linking to a report from the Romanian government describing it. So when this is happening, it's like, why isn't the Romanian government also broadcasting this in English and saying, hey, look, the European Union, look, United States, we need to fight this propaganda that's coming out from Russia.
Mhm.
These are the tactics that they're using. We need to come up with a way and how to work together to back this.
So it's
You
about
know,
the lack.
that it,
It's about the lack of strategic communication.
yes, because
Right.
that burden is on Romania. You can't be critical of Trump's comment if Romanian government is not communicating this in English because
Mhm.
if as you know, most Americans speak English and that's it. And most people in the European Union do not understand Romanian. It's and because and especially for people who haven't studied Slavic languages, the fact that Romanian has some Slavic roots as well, besides
Yeah,
Romance roots, even for me, studying Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, and a little French, it's hard to still sometimes understand different things in Romanian. So
of course.
shame on Romania for not also broadcasting this in English and saying, look at what Russia did. These are the exact examples that we could come up with the interference. And that's not happening. It's simple because the issue is when it's simply thrown around like that, people no longer believe it. Where the problem is mainstream media, whenever it doesn't like an election result,
Hmm.
such as in the US, they cry wolf. So how do we go from 2016, oh well that's Russia's fault, to then when 2020 when Joe Biden won, it was the most secure election, it's great. And then the Biden and Harris campaign was already setting the stage to, well, if Biden loses again when he was still running, that's Russia's fault too, because it was Russian interference. Oh, I'm sorry. Putin didn't want to get involved in 2020. He decided he'll take off season. I mean, come on. And that's the issue where there's not the exact examples being described. It just comes off as the little boy who cried wolf. Where is that is that fable common in Romania? Is it well known with the fact that because in the US it is the fact that
Okay.
the little boy kept on crying to the villagers, wolf, wolf, when there was no wolf attacking the sheep. So then when there actually was a wolf, nobody believed him. And well, the wolf had a great dinner. That's the issue where Romania needs to be clear, where the burden is on the Romanian government to describe these things more in depth on this is what Russia did to our first round. So come on, ask for help from the US, ask for help from the European Union on to fight disinformation and foreign interference from Russia
Hmm.
in order to have a more secure election. But when that's not happening and it's simply kind of thrown around without any direct link so people could read on it themselves, it comes off as just a buzzword being thrown around without any meaning attached to it. And that's, and that's what needs to be hit on strong going into a new presidential election that no, this isn't a buzzword being thrown around because the Romanian government likes Georgescu. We actually have all this evidence of interference, and this is what happened, rather than simply saying or throwing it out and then no links to those specific examples to a report like you were mentioning, where it sounds like there are reports in Romanian describing the
Yeah,
interference that happened, but that's not being translated into English, which is a huge flaw because
I agree with you. I I
how are
totally
people
agree.
supposed to believe this outside Romania if you don't speak Romanian? And if you're not familiar with how to find the source, because that's the issue too for you and me, when we're researchers, you already earned your PhD. I'm on the cusp of getting it. But at the same time, if you're not completely familiar with the sources on how to get data and information
Hmm.
from within Romania, it makes it hard to bring it up. And when these mainstream English news sources are not saying, here's the link, even if it's Romania, here's the link, and you can try to use Google Translate to understand it somewhat for yourself, they're not doing that. They're not linking when they say Russian interference.
We will do in our comment box of this episode, but because we are very close to the end, I like to ask you something very important for the future of EU, and I think also for the future of NATO. Nick, considering because you're an expert in American and European politics. Considering the severity of those electoral interference in Romania and Republic of Moldova, too, in Bulgaria too, do you think NATO and the EU should rethink their security and defense strategies to safeguard democratic process
Yes,
across these
absolutely.
member states?
Absolutely. Um, because that's kind of become the issue where a lot of these European nations agreed to the 2% rule.
Hmm.
And people then try to say, oh, well, that's not in the NATO treaty, so we don't have to abide by it. Well, yes, you do, because all these member states of NATO agreed to this in the early 2000s. And now they're trying to say, finally, many member states have increased their spending after the invasion of Ukraine, but that's too little too late. When you missed all these years of developing your military strength,
Hmm.
it's hard to make up for it just because you suddenly increase funding for your military in the past 2 to 3 years when an invasion of Ukraine already started. That's too little too late. And I got to be honest, I definitely do agree with Trump not wanting to foot the bill. Shame on Europeans for not putting more pressure to be able to defend themselves. I mean, when you look at NATO, most of the military strength comes from the US and then Turkey, which why would Europe trust Turkey with its defense when currently Turkey is helping protect
Hmm.
Hamas terrorists?
Right.
Turkey is not a good NATO member state. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of getting to the point. It's like, and then with the actions that Turkey's taking in the Middle East, people want to criticize the US, but what about Turkey? Turkey cut off people from access to water, 1 million Kurds, because it keeps on taking actions in Syria. And
Hmm.
yet nobody criticizes Turkey. Why is that? That's very dangerous as well. And Europe needs to not be reliant on NATO, thinking that the U.S. and Turkey is going to be able to then save the EU when the EU needs to be able to also defend itself. And luckily, many member states have increased their funding, but still, Spain hasn't increased enough. France, Italy. It's like, okay, and what more needs to be done?
Hmm.
There's already an invasion in Europe of Ukraine, and yet it's like European governments still expect, oh, well, NATO will bail us out, or hopefully our membership to NATO will be enough of to deter Russia from invading us as well. Which, to be brutally honest, with how much Russia has struggled with invading Ukraine, it's probably not even going to try to start a war with a NATO member state because of the potential threat of all these member states, and with the fact that, to be fair, I think it was a great strategic move where, to me personally, I do believe that the report
Hmm.
of what Germany would do if Poland was invaded was leaked. I think that was leaked purposely by the German government to deter Russia, with showing how, as people always love to joke about Germany invading Poland in the past world wars, this wouldn't be an invasion. This would be a very welcome backup of German
Hmm.
troops marching their way through Poland to defend it and saying, no, we're not letting you take Poland. Poland's an EU member state, it's a NATO member state. We're also going to defend it, and this is how quickly we could get the troops, where we could get all these supplies to Poland with a matter of days. That was, I think, a pretty intelligent maneuver by Germany.
Hmm.
And as you see, uh, Russia hasn't threatened anything. Russia hasn't leaked anything because that was issue two with Russia leaking plans with Belarus and Moldova trying to integrate both as its own territory within a certain amount of time. But yeah, Europe really needs to step up its game and not depend so much on NATO, which is primarily the US and then Turkey
Hmm.
for defense, which Turkey is an ally of Russia. Could we really count? Could the EU really count on Turkey to help them if Russia attacks the EU? It could possibly be a situation like Greece, where Greece refused to take action within Serbia
Yeah.
when Serbia was committing crimes against humanity in the civil war in Yugoslavia. Greece refused to participate. Why would we think that that wouldn't possibly happen with Turkey then? where even though Turkey doesn't always get along with Russia, Turkey's still much more likely to go against the European Union. The fact that its membership has stalled, Erdogan refuses to implement democratic reforms into Turkey to be able to become an EU member state,
Mhm.
even though it applied decades ago. So the EU really should not count on NATO, especially when, at the end of the day, as it is, nations also have to be willing to fight themselves. And it is alarming when you look at polls within the European Union member states, how a lot of people would say no, they would not fight for their own country, or talking about, oh, well, if Europe's invaded, I'll just go to Morocco. Okay. And you don't think that's going to further motivate Americans to say, well, if Europeans aren't going to fight for themselves, screw that.
Mhm.
I'm not sending my own children to die for them in Europe. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
And it's, and that's part of the issue too, that when European Union citizens want to put out this hateful rhetoric against Americans constantly, America sucks as a country, it sucks, it sucks, it sucks. Why do you think that Americans are going to be willing to march them back through Europe and
Mhm.
help them once again if another major war happens in Europe? Because social media luckily didn't exist back then, so Americans weren't necessarily aware about sentiments in Europe towards
Yeah.
Americans. But now, when you have Europeans very proud of their hatred of the US, why would you expect the United States to be like, oh, absolutely, we'll sacrifice soldiers to defend you? If uh, Europeans, not all, but unfortunately, a large margin. The United States is a terrible country. Okay, then you could defend yourself. Yeah. I mean, and that's the unfortunate thing that
Yeah.
people need to rethink what they say because, uh, and then when they try to say things like, oh, well, Americans aren't good at geography, which to be fair, there's only 27 member states in the EU. There's 50 US states alone to
Mhm.
memorize in your own country. So it's like, okay, then yeah, why would Americans die for a city they've never heard of in Europe? You could defend yourself. Have fun with fighting against Putin then if you hate the US and you love criticizing it so much then. And that's the thing that people need to realize that you really should be careful with what you put out on social media. But, it is what it is. The EU has to learn to work better together for common security. But,
Mhm.
who knows if that'll ever happen with
Yeah.
disagreements.
Right. So, Nick, as we wrap up today's episode, for me, it's clear that the challenges facing Romania and also Europe as well are not just about isolated incidents of
No.
electoral interference or the rise of populist messianism. Uh, they reflect a deeper vulnerability within democratic systems where trust in institutions it's eroded, and external actors explore these fractures from their own gain. And whether through social media platforms like TikTok or Facebook, transnational networks, or the weaponization of populist, as Professor Serrano said, weaponization of populist narratives, the stakes for safeguarding democracy have never been high. And of course, it's essential for Romania and its allies in the EU and NATO to confront these threats with renewed focus and unity. But beyond, as you mentioned, beyond policy and security measures, the real battleground lies in rebuilding trust in institutions, trust in the rule of law, and trust in the collective strength of democracy. Thank you very much once again for joining us on the EU Spectator today. And as always, we'll continue to keep a close eye on these critical developments. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged. Thank you very much once again, Nick, for your expertise.
Thank you, and hopefully these government institutions really step it up. Romania institutions have to be very clear also in English about Russian interference and about the steps that it'll take to combat it in the next election to show that this is a serious threat. This isn't simply a buzzword being thrown around. For our viewers, if you stay to the end, make sure you comment something to help us get boosted in the algorithm. Some random emoji, whatever. Make sure you also are already subscribed to the channel if you are not. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you.